Thank you so much, Joe. I have to say I've taken a great deal more from the Center for Mark Twain Studies than I've given, and I might someday give those things back. Before I get started, I would like to give thanks, first of all, to Joe and Matt Siebold, who I think are doing an extraordinary job of really broadening the scope of what you do here at the center. I'd also like to give what the young people call a shout out to Ann Cady, who's here today. Could you give a little wave there? Okay. Ann has done so much to honor the memory of Michael Kiskis, who many of us, he was our dear friend, and has helped to put forward the fellowship, the Michael Kiskis Fellowship, which will support the work of young scholars coming to the center. So there will be, you know, new little baby Kiskises and Ryans coming along, developing new ideas about Twain, and we really want to thank Ann for everything that she's done. So thank you, Ann. Okay, so I want to warn you that this is a slightly snarky, not so nice talk about Mark Twain. And last night I was just sharing with my friends here that I forgot, you know, I had all the lights out, and I forgot that I had hung this suit up downstairs, and I walked down and thought Mark Twain was waiting for me. And he was not happy. So anyway, I'm glad I'm leaving tonight because he'll be much, much less happy after this talk. So in 2010, after decades of tireless research and editing, the Mark Twain Project at the University of Berkeley published the first volume of Mark Twain's 3-volume autobiography. If Mark Twain could have planned a publishing and marketing coup, and in many ways he did, this would have been it. In the opening chapters from my autobiography, published in 1906, Twain writes, "I intend this autobiography shall become a model for all future autobiographies when it is published after my death. And I also intend that it shall be read and admired a good many centuries because of its form and method, a form and method whereby the past and present are constantly brought face to face, resulting in contrasts which newly fire up the interest all along, like contact of flint with steel." Just as Twain directed, his complete autobiography was published 100 years after his death, which presumably meant that anyone who could be hurt, offended, or shocked by its revelations would already have passed into eternity. It also meant that Twain's name, his writing, the details of his life and travels, and his opinions from the profound to the silly would remain solidly planted on the front pages of American culture, exactly the kind of afterlife Twain imagined for himself. The first of the 3-volume set sold over 500,000 copies within a year of its publication. It became what Julie Bozeman of the New York Times described as a smash hit, a perfect holiday gift for bookish fathers and uncles. "It's totally the dad book of the year," said Rebecca Fitting, an owner of Greenlight Bookstore in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. "It's that autobiography, biography, history category, a certain kind of guy gift book." Who is that certain kind of guy? According to the marketing departments of major booksellers, he likes to fish and grill. He may participate in Civil War reenactments, and he likes to read a lot of biographies about heroes, leaders, and entrepreneurs. He's a version of that Norman Rockwell dad, a father figure who is as much a product of cultural nostalgia as the Tom Sawyer we find in Hannibal, Missouri. But more about that later. They're going to hate me in Hannibal after this, I just want you to know. For those who marketed and sold the autobiography, this target audience is white, male, and suburban. And his sense of America, like his sense of humor, is fairly sentimental. Without question, many of those thousands of volumes were purchased by readers, like some of the people here in this room, with a deep appreciation for the nuances of Mark Twain's life. And they were prepared for the postmodern creativity of his memoir. Yet just as certainly, there were many more of that certain kind of guy who purchased this first volume hoping to meet the Disney version of Mark Twain, an icon of American nobility, the homespun sage of a simpler time. This latter group of readers felt disappointed, even betrayed by his autobiography. Something like the way fans responded when Bob Dylan went electric. Let me introduce you to one of these disappointed dads. In his New York Times book review, an especially outraged and aggrieved Garrison Keillor, a performer who, not for nothing, has turned folksy into a cottage industry, complained that the autobiography was a wonderful fraud on the order of the Duke and the Dauphin. I actually think he meant the Duke and the King. Got that wrong. He goes on. Here, sandwiched between a 58 barrage of an introduction and 180 pages of footnotes, is a rag bag of scraps, some of interest, most of them not, the dictated reminiscences of an old man in a dithery voice. Like, who is Garrison Keillor to talk about dithering? Okay. Like an undergraduate who'd prefer to read the Spark Notes, Keillor breezed through the critical commentary and glanced at the introduction, which is fascinating, by the way. You should read that introduction. He found ample proof that, quote, in the hands of academics, Twain can be just as tedious as anybody else. While no sane person can disagree with his assessment of the numbing charms of academic prose, that isn't quite what bothers Keillor. Let's not forget that Keillor has made millions living in a sweet, vaguely ironic, but always kindly hit place called Lake Wobegon, ready? Where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. It's a lovely, harmless place, but I think we all know that's not where Mark Twain lives. At least not the Twain I've been reading, studying, and writing about for over 25 years. When Keillor opened the autobiography, what he hoped for was an encounter with the white-suited icon, the cracker-barrel philosopher who loves cats and children. He was disappointed when, instead, the human being behind the pseudonym emerged. I'd like to suggest that the massive popularity of this first volume of the autobiography and Keillor's acerbic book review are two versions of the same story. Written deeply into American culture, more accurately the culture of white America, is a love affair with a myth named Mark Twain. And I believe that love is dangerous, sometimes even toxic, especially when it affects our teaching and our scholarship. Too often we defend the myth of the man rather than exploring the more complicated truths that define him. In the cultural spaces that memorialize Twain, from the Mark Twain Shrine in Florida, Missouri, to the theme park that is Hannibal, we often find his lived history is as whitewashed as the fences in Tom Sawyer. Given our current political environment, when any mention of any part of our racial history, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, is seen as potentially traumatizing to our students, the places that traffic in a Disney version of Twain look and feel complicit. At the other extreme, in some of the high school and college classrooms where Twain is still taught, we find that Twain is extolled as a racial progressive. We, and by that we I mean critics like myself who make a living writing and thinking about Twain, we insist that Twain was anti-racist, or that his use of racial epithets was an expression of irony. Or finally, we point to his affection for specific black people to counter the painful racial caricatures he would sometimes deploy and enjoy. This is another kind of whitewashing, and it's also a betrayal of the complexity of the man and the country in which he lived. Rather than confront the battlefield of ideas that inspired Sam Clemens, his fiction and his humor, we engage in a sepia-tinted romance with Mark Twain. This allegiance to St. Mark makes us suspect before our students who yearn for an honest encounter with the hard edges of Twain's life and fiction. That America is in love with Mark Twain is a thesis so obviously true it may not need defending. And yet Twain is far from being the only American author to inspire a passionate following, nor is he the only one who continues to be an object of cultural fascination. Emily Dickinson is now the subject of a cheeky television series which has managed to cast her somewhat improbably as a funky devotee of hip-hop and somewhat more probably a fan of cannabis. If you'll look at the middle page from her little pressed flower book, some of you are going to see that Emily there's a reason she stayed in her room so much. Okay. The Baltimore Ravens football team takes its name and mascot from hometown favorite Edgar Allan Poe, who only lived there 3 years, but who honored the city with his mysterious death in 1849. In Key West, Florida, more than one tavern claims to be the original Sloppy Joe's, Ernest Hemingway's favorite bar, and they hold competing look-alike contests selling Hemingway trinkets and paraphernalia. There are Henry David Thoreau bumper stickers and earrings, Louisa May Alcott dolls and teacups, Toni Morrison quilts and holiday ornaments, and Willa Cather socks and action figures. I might need to get a Willa Cather action figure. American culture can turn almost any artist into an object to be traded, bought, and sold. Nonetheless, if Mark Twain's popularity were measured only in terms of the tchotchkes we sell, he would dominate this curious marketplace. There are gift shops and libraries across the country stocked with, now buckle up, Twain coffee mugs and bobbleheads and Legos. That's from the Hartford House. I don't know why they have it there. More Legos, tote bags, Twain cigars, keychains and finger puppets, commemorative coins, scented candles. What? Come on. Like, what scent is Mark Twain? Like lavender? I don't. Cigar. Tumblers, whiskey flasks, whiskey brands, corncob pipes, huckleberry jams, and Twain bottle openers, T-shirts, craft beers, and American flags, and for me, at least, the most frightening, Mark Twain tattoos. And, like, look at, there's a lot of hair around that middle one, and I don't want to know where it was. We'll take that off quickly. What fuels this commercial enterprise? It's something more than just a love of kitsch. It's a desire to possess Mark Twain, to own a piece of his legacy, to be intimately connected to him. Mark Twain's fans and admirers, often described as Twainiacs, and I know some of us here have described ourselves that way, are drawn not only to objects that bear his name, his words, or his image, they are drawn to the Twain persona. They self-identify with the writer. They long to inhabit what one fan described as a simpler time and place, which they believe he represents. If this simpler time and place has an address, it's located at the farm of John Quarles in Florida, Missouri. In his autobiography, Twain describes his uncle's farm as a heavenly place for a boy, quote, where all the Negroes were friends of ours, and that it was on that farm where he got, quote, a strong liking for African Americans. Twain claims that those summers on the farm, living among the enslaved, taught him to respect their dignity. Quote, the black face is as welcome to me now as it was then, and generations of critics have taken him at his word. Twain recalls those days in a literary incantation of over 1,500 words, arranged in a long series of assertions, I know, and I can call back, and I remember, and I can see, followed by strings of prepositional phrases and dependent clauses, as if the memories and images flow more quickly than his pen can record. Twain revives his childhood. It is some of the most seductive, gorgeous writing of his career. I can call it all back and make it as real as it ever was and as blessed. I can call back the prairie and its lonesomeness and peace, and a vast hawk hanging motionless in the sky with his wings spread wide and blue, of the vault, and the blue of the vault showing through the fringe of their end feathers. I know how the wild blackberries looked and how they tasted, and the same with the pawpaws, the hazelnuts, and the persimmons. And I can feel the thumping rain upon my head of hickory nuts and walnuts when we were out in the frosty dawn to scrabble for them with the pigs. And the gusts of wind loosed them and sent them down. This is the way we'd all like to imagine childhood. But the very loveliness of the passage becomes problematic when memory turns into history. Nestled within these innocent, soothing recollections, the fact of slavery appears little more than a charming anachronism, like the horse and buggy or hoop skirts. We can draw a line from Twain's reminiscences about the Quarles farm to the work of biographers who extol its virtues, to the lost cause narratives that rise up at the beginning of the 20th century, to the reproductions of Tom Sawyer's Fence and Becky's Home in Hannibal, and I would argue, the current desire to censor any mention of slavery or the Civil War in American classrooms. Most of the critical biographies of Twain, with the exception of anything written by Albert Bigelow Paine, acknowledge the racism that was a tacit part of Twain's life. However, many of these same works characterize his time on John Quarles' farm as, quote, an idyll. and Twain's friendship with the enslaved Daniel as a beautiful example of racial harmony. In 1912, Paine writes that it was just one long, idyllic dream of summertime and freedom. His tendency to mischief grew with this wide liberty, improved health, and the encouragement of John Quarles's good-natured, fun-loving slaves. In 1934, Minnie Brashear writes, "It was on the farm, besides, that he learned to know the habits of animals and birds. There he had the close acquaintance of colored people, which made him, in after years, one of their most eloquent defenders. On the farm, Twain savored the free, joyous life." What's interesting is how many of these biographers point out how free Twain was without noticing the tension between the enslaved people who were living in close quarters with him. In 1952, Dixon Wechter writes, quote, "Sam could not help contrasting Judge Clemens' cold, formal reserve and the pinched little household in Hannibal with Uncle John Quarles's warm, hearty country hospitality and the wonderful table over which he and Aunt Patsy presided, surrounded by their 8 happy children and a flock of enchanting slaves. This was the good life." In 1954, Jerry Allen writes, "Sam's best friend on the farm was Uncle Dan'l, a middle-aged slave, a faithful and affectionate ally. Uncle Dan'l could neither read nor write, that being white folks' privilege, but he had a sound, independent head on his shoulders. Long after Uncle Dan'l's tutoring ceased, the lessons of the compassionate Negro stayed with him." Many of these early biographies reproduce Twain's own language without critique or citation. Yet even in more recent works, we find biographers simply echoing Twain. In 2003, Fred Kaplan describes the Quarles farm using many of Twain's phrases, and where he builds on Twain's memories, he does so with romantic assumptions about enslaved people. There, playing with his cousins and nurtured by the domestic warmth and comparative affluence of the Quarles household, his respect and affection for Black people flourished. They were a vital part of the farm's life, both in the house and in the fields. He never saw a Black person mistreated there, and he never saw a Black person there who did not carry himself or herself with dignity and respect. Now, it may be that the Quarles farm inspired in these enslaved people the strength of character Kaplan describes, but how would we know? More importantly, how does Kaplan? It's wishful thinking. And if the farm gave the young Sam Clemens a lesson in respect and dignity, where do some of his more offensive representations of Black men in particular come from? Twain's own claim that none of the slaves on John Quarles' farm were ever mistreated may also be a pretty misplaced description of what it means to harm another human being. More than any other moment in Twain's life story, his time on the Quarles farm invites biographers to rhapsodize about racial harmony. These memories have a corollary in the rise of lost cause cultural narratives, in the novels of Thomas Dixon Jr., in the statues of Moses, Jacob, Ezekiel, in particular the Confederate Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, and in the political advocacy of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and in the resurrection of Confederate emblems in state and local flags, to name a few. Despite the sharp satire that Twain directs at the chivalric ideas of slave-owning Christians, his nostalgic portrait of the Quarles farm anticipates a more insidious nostalgia for a time and a place that never existed. In 1915, when D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation is first released, the look of the Camerons' gracious home, complete with happy slave children at play and even a, quote, well-fed, well-petted, and properly revered cat, and that's from Twain's Pudd'nhead. And I'm not suggesting that Dixon had been reading Pudd'nhead. What I'm suggesting is that everyone's swimming in the same pool. It celebrates the myth of the antebellum South. The scene echoes the look of Dawson's Landing and the nostalgia that surrounds the Quarles farm. Missing, of course, is Twain's critique of what lies beneath the historical whitewash, a process that continues through the 20th century in the sunny portrait of Scarlett O'Hara's girlhood at Tara, in the zippity-doo-dah melodies of the Song of the South, or in Disney's various animatronic renderings of Tom Sawyer's Island. We can see and hear the imagined loveliness of the Quarles farm. We can call it all back and make it as real as it ever was. For over 60 years, Hannibal, Missouri, self-anointed as America's hometown, has hosted National Tom Sawyer Days, complete with fence painting, frog jumping contests, and of course this is a very typical Twain event, mud volleyball. There are concerts and some good barbecue and even a Baby Beautiful contest. As a culminating moment in the festivities, two, quote, goodwill ambassadors from the 7th grade are chosen to play the parts of Becky and Tom. At no point in the fun, however, do we see reenacted the lives of Daniel, Mary, Jenny, or Ned, the slaves bought, sold, and rented by the Clemens family. No one plays the part of John Marshall Clemens as he whips Jenny for disobedience. No child auditions for the part of Sandy, wondering where his mother is, and no one acts the part of Marianne Cord as she tells the story of how her children were auctioned off to pay the debts of her old mistress. What we remember from Twain's childhood is collectively what we want to remember. Now, I live, I don't know about you guys, in an upstate New York Rust Belt city, and I don't blame any chamber of commerce for doing its utmost to create a feeling of community, maybe even boost the economy. And who can object to babies and corn dogs and mud volleyball? I can't, especially babies doing mud volleyball. There's something, right? I suppose what troubles me most about Hannibal and the nearby Mark Twain Shrine is that the fantasy has so completely obscured the history. Tucked into the corner of downtown Hannibal, not officially a part of the Boyhood Home and Museum, is the ironically titled Huck Finn Freedom Center, Jim's Journey. You do want to pull somebody aside and say, you do know that Jim doesn't go anywhere, right? That we don't know what happens to Jim, and Huck really was only interested in his own freedom. It's very complicated. Nonetheless, it's a product of the devotion of J. Fake Dant, the executive director, and it's an impressive effort to tell the story of black Hannibalians, as well as the true story of the enslaved people who inspired Twain. It is, however, marginalized by its lack of institutional support, by its place in the town, and most of all, by our appetites for more palatable stories and images, appetites catered to in the museum gift shop, at the permanent Norman Rockwell exhibit, and at Mark Twain's cave, where Twain himself performs weekly. One of Hannibal's largest industries is tourism, and no one is traveling there to hear a true story about slavery in Twain's time or racism in our own. These tourists want to meet Twain, the American Peter Pan, an eternal boy whose innocence is as apparent as the white suit. And this, by the way, is one of the many reasons I admire the city of Elmira College, and the Center for Mark Twain Studies, and of course, the Langdon family. Okay, yes, you have a Mark Twain Motor Inn, which terrifies me. Every time I go by that, I'm like, who's staying there? You have a Mark Twain golf course. But more than any other site where Twain lived and worked, you honor his genius, not his pseudonym. In the conferences you host at events such as this, and most of all in your recognition that Quarry Farm has never been and should never be a theme park, you preserve everything that made Twain an artist. You traffic in ideas, no matter how complicated, with only the occasional tote bag as a gift. I feel blessed to have been your neighbor for so long. By sidestepping issues of race, these other places miss the opportunity to highlight the moments when Twain gets it right. He was acutely aware of what we might call today structural racism, the ways in which seemingly sympathetic individuals, from the fictional Aunt Sally to the actual Jane Clemens, adapt to the racist ideologies, practices, and customs more easily than they resist or question them. He understood how culture trains and indoctrinates, which makes it possible for evil to be normalized and even celebrated. But it's hard to attract visitors to an exhibit about how John Marshall Clemens whipped the slave girl Jenny, or about how a slave man in Hannibal was struck down with a chunk of slag for some small offense, or even about the actual fate of Daniel Quarles and his children, which we can talk about later. When Twain writes, "There were no hard-hearted people in our town," that's ironic. And that irony is lost in most public displays about his childhood. For many Twain tourists, most of whom are white, the cultural narrative that has grown up around Sam Clemens is often far more powerful and palatable than the literature he created or the life he lived. In venues across the country, from Hannibal to Hartford to Virginia City to San Francisco, scores of Twain impersonators make a living, with varying degrees of success, by resurrecting a version of Mark Twain whose humor is essentially non-threatening and accessible. Their routines are punctuated with jokes about cats in Congress, watermelons in the German language, or playing hooky and stealing jam. At a performance by impersonator McAvoy Lane, by the way, I was supposed to linger there so you could all say, "Oh, we're really wonderful here." At a performance by impersonator McAvoy Lane, the gathered audience relished the sentimentality they encountered on stage. The New York Times reports, most in the audience at this tiny storefront theater in a snowy shopping center on the shore of Lake Tahoe had not ventured to buy, let alone read, the hefty hardback. But many had nonetheless been inspired by the book's promotion to come out and hear Mr. Lane tell Twain stories, which they said left them nostalgic for simpler, more adventurous times. "Mark Twain just makes you feel good," said Jim Giancola, 62, a retired banker. Overwhelmingly, this is the goal of most Twain impersonators, to leave the audience feeling content, pleased, warm, and secure. Certainly as a stand, and we can sort of talk whether or not you agree that the Hal Holbrook was doing that. I think he's sometimes got some good stuff in there. Certainly as a stand-up comic looking to earn a living, Twain himself aimed for just such a sweet spot. However, as a literary artist, making us feel good may not have been Twain's first priority. Twain cultivated a sense of humor that has a far more complicated, less comforting trajectory. As Huck might describe it, it's not the pleasant kind, but the kind of laughter that makes you feel when you are eating bread that's got sand in it. While Twain's satire is often aimed at the powerful and the unjust, and some Twain impersonators will occasionally reproduce these narratives, his humor also traffics in racial caricature and racist vocabulary, and he deploys them on occasion for no higher purpose than to make his audience laugh, regardless of the pain it causes along the way. The transgressive nature of Twain's humor is not always in service of the good. Sometimes it's a weapon he engages for the pleasure of hitting a target, any target. This makes Twain a fascinating subject to study and a dangerous artist to bring into the classroom. I've been pretty hard on Hannibal, and I've been dismissive of all those hardworking Twain impersonators in their white suits and wigs. Now I'm going to turn my attention to my own backyard and spend some time among the academics. It would be comforting, oh, there's an old academic right there. It would be comforting to assume that Twain scholars are far too analytical, too clear-eyed and objective, or as Garrison Keillor would have it, too dry and tedious to fall into the trap of loving Mark Twain. While the occasional Twain necktie or Huck Finn nutcracker may surface among our possessions, surely trained academics are able to balance their affection for Twain against the truth of our research and the demands of the classroom. However, as it turns out, resisting the charm of Mark Twain is harder than it seems. After a lifetime of studying his biography, reading his letters, after the death of Susie, Livy, or Jean, for example, or even bearing witness to his struggles, his efforts to follow the better angels of his nature, scholars can find it difficult not to develop a sympathy for Twain. Over the days and years of reflecting on the life of Mark Twain, many of us feel a kind of affinity for the author. And to that circumstance, we can add the magnetism of Twain's vernacular poetry. It takes very little prompting for most of us to put on his southern drawl, to slip into the music of his prose, and to adopt the wry humors of a master satirist. In other words, the inherently performative nature of Mark Twain's writing has the potential, now I ruined my joke, to turn almost anyone, even a wizened old academic. I don't show very many people myself in my jammy pants while I have my coffee, into a Twain impersonator. We enter our classrooms trailing behind us a long record of study and the deep knowledge of our subject, and perhaps inevitably, we hope to inspire our students with a bit of the same enthusiasm. It may be the case that all literature professors must guard against their own affection for their subject, whether they're teaching the works of William Shakespeare or Margaret Atwood. The stakes are higher in an American classroom when the author in question is Mark Twain. More damage has been done by professors and secondary school teachers insisting that there is nothing racist in Twain's life and work than has been done by any sentimental Twain exhibit in Hannibal or any performance by a Twain impersonator. Black readers in particular have shared childhood memories of classrooms where Huck Finn was read and where Twain was celebrated. They describe feeling humiliated, angry, and objectified. In her introduction to Huck Finn, Toni Morrison writes, "Fear and alarm are what I remember most about my first encounter with Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Palpable alarm. Unlike the Treasure Island excursion of Tom Sawyer, at no point along Huck's journey was a happy ending signaled or guaranteed. Reading Huckleberry Finn, chosen randomly without any guidance or recommendation, was disturbing, was deeply disturbing." When we privilege the claim that Twain is beyond question anti-racist, that any use of racist vocabulary or racist caricature is in service to irony, we participate in a legacy of bad teaching that has traumatized generations. And in doing so, we not only lose credibility before our students, we miss an opportunity to engage the deeper complexities and contradictions in Twain's work and the often racist culture that produced him. What we may be looking for is a white hero. One example of a white person who rose above the racism of the family that reared him, the community that taught him, and the country in which he lived. As white instructors, and Twain instructors, are overwhelmingly white, we want Twain in some deeply buried corner of our consciousness to whitewash us. If we can prove that he never had a racist thought or impulse, then maybe we haven't either, and then it's all right for us to love him. Critics have often presented Twain's contemporary relationships with black men as a kind of absolution for the infantilized representations of black masculinity he sometimes creates in his fiction. He writes glowingly about the courage of John Lewis, on the far left, the wit of George Griffin, I couldn't find a picture of him. He respects the integrity of Frederick Douglass and the entrepreneurship of Booker T. Washington. These personal relationships, however, are distinct from the powerful cultural narrative in which Twain's invested, economically, and that's important, and psychologically. A narrative that celebrates characters such as Sambo and Jim Crow in the 19th century, and Stepin Fetchit, Amos and Andy, and Mantan Moreland in the 20th. All of whom, it could be argued, share some cultural DNA in his fearful, superstitious, feminized, and childlike incarnations. And these are the drawings that E.W. Kemble did for Huck Finn. Twain created Jim as a loving father and a kind friend, but he also painted him as a clown. Mark Twain gave us Pap Finn, who pushed a black professor, quote, who knowed everything and could speak all kinds of languages, off the road and into the mud. And he described the operatic paranoia of Sister Hotchkiss, who thought it best to lash every slave on the Phelps farm until they talked. She also encourages them to skin them alive, which I also thought was, for a long time I thought it was metaphor, until I read that Nat Turner was skinned after he was executed, and his fingers, ears, and nose and skull were sold off as souvenirs. Fun, huh? You having a good time? Okay. He imagined a Tom Sawyer who thought it would be fun to tie Jim to a tree. He taught Huck to respect Jim and then allowed him to forget those lessons in exchange for a laugh. Mark Twain traveled in some pretty dark and dirty imaginative realms, and sometimes it rubbed off. And one of the reasons I love him is that he knew it. At the most recent quadrennial conference on the state of Mark Twain studies, we heard several Twain scholars make passionate arguments that were based on the premise that Mark Twain was consciously anti-racist. Of course, for Twain to be anti-racist, he would have to be dedicated to promoting a racially just America and to dismantling racist structures and practices. Was he? Sometimes. Maybe. Defending this premise as an absolute, however, becomes difficult if our students then point to Nat, and that's a drawing of Nat on the left, who appears in the closing chapters of Huck Finn, a caricature of superstitious, childlike black masculinity. Or if they wonder why Twain would commission E.W. Kemble, illustrator of, and we can see on the right, comical coons. or even if they were troubled by Twain's casual use of the N-word in his correspondence and his dedicated use of it in the novel. In a recent book review, for example, one scholar suggested that African-American readers who object to Twain's use of racial epithets fail to appreciate the satiric goals of the author. It's a response that's as stale as it is entrenched, a stunning example of a certain kind of white privilege. This easy dismissal of black pain is fueled by a longing to believe in the transcendent goodness of a fictional creation, St. Mark of Hannibal. In 1996, novelist Jane Smiley published an indictment of Mark Twain. Quote, "Say It Ain't So, Huck's Second Thoughts on Mark Twain's Masterpiece." Followed the next year by Jonathan Erick's Huckleberry Finn as Idol and Target. Both pieces argued against canonizing the novel or the author, and with varying success, they argued on behalf of marginalized students and readers. At the time, I dismissed their arguments with all the arrogance of a newly minted PhD. I knowed everything. And while I still believe in the value of teaching Mark Twain's fiction, and while I still think Smiley's portrait of Twain as a villain is just as naive as any idolization of him, I've long since come to agree with the spirit that inspired both works. In 2022, as I sat listening to some of my colleagues defend a strategic reading of the N-word in class and in performance, as if it acquired special talismanic magical qualities when used by Mark Twain, I understood completely why Twain is being written out of so many curriculums. If the only path we have to accessing the racial context for Mark Twain's fiction is through the repeated use of that word, or if we ask students to ignore evidence that Twain was not always a racial progressive, then we have misread not only the author, but our responsibilities as instructors. And let me add this as an aside. It's equally problematic to imagine that simply eliminating the N-word from Twain's texts also eliminates the racist discourse his writing sometimes generates. Seeing that language on the page is powerful enough. It's a reminder for students of the noxious realities and histories it communicates. I don't need to give it breath and life in conversation. American students are living at a moment of increasing racial violence. Just at little old Lemoyne, in the last 10 years, I've been to 4 funerals of African-American students killed violently. They have an acute understanding of what constitutes a racist word or gesture, and not because they're fragile, but because they're worldly. To ask them to ignore their own reactions to Twain's writing is not just a disservice, it's dishonest as well. Fortunately, I was not alone in my reaction to that conversation. Many of my colleagues have a nuanced and complicated reading of Twain's racial politics. And I'd like to offer 3 examples which I've relied on greatly as I work on this book. Terrell Dempsey's Searching for Jim, Slavery in Sam Clemens' World is really a phenomenal book. Written, I think, in, I want to say 2000, I'm just going to make it up, in 4. It's a detailed exploration of every aspect of life in Hannibal. Advertisements in newspapers, sermons, political events. And it really reveals how deeply entrenched the slave culture was there. Satire or Evasion is an older collection of essays by African-American scholars, and it's smart and revealing, edited by Jim Leonard and Tom Tenney. And finally, Carrie Driscoll's really magnificent work, Mark Twain Among the Indians. She does just a stunning level of detailed analysis of Twain's interaction and his family and the culture that he lived in with Native American peoples and with the politics of Native Americans. It's a wonderful book. I also found that many of my colleagues at the Twain Conference, and I would say that many of them, of our younger colleagues, are doing extraordinary work in the classroom. They place Mark Twain alongside artists from his own time. Charles Chestnut, Frederick Douglass, Willa Cather, and they have action figures to go now. Willa Cather or Harriet Jacobs, and they measure him against the humor of contemporary performers like Dave Chappelle or Chris Rock. Or they put him in dialogue with current events, from the murder of George Floyd to the January 6th insurrection. In other words, they take him off his pedestal and allow him to be buffeted by the world that he engaged so fully. These instructors create a rigorous, uncompromising experience of Mark Twain's fiction without ignoring the racial experiences of their students. And I want to throw in one thing here before I close. I know that we have probably a few current secondary school teachers and certainly some retired secondary school teachers. And I think that those instructors are facing a world that I would not be able to negotiate. I think teaching in secondary school right now is you should get battlefield pay. And if you attempt to do some of the work I'm suggesting, you could very well find yourself protested or sued, which is stunning. So, you know, you have all of my respect. I just want to throw that out there. There are many things that I love about Mark Twain. His disdain for violence and those who romanticize it, his appreciation for friendship, and his sympathy for the suffering of children. I love that he listened to Marianne Cord tell her story of pain and suffering, and I love that he was willing to admit to the world how much he didn't want to. I love his humor, particularly when it takes aim at a worthy target, hypocrites especially, and Christians who don't know anything about kindness. And I love the music of his writing and the humanity that resonates throughout that vernacular. But I was never drawn to Mark Twain because he was a saint. Quite the opposite. I recognize in him a fellow sinner, a flawed and flailing human being, never quite sane in the night. He would, on occasion, take pleasure in causing pain, but he understood that racism is a kind of family heirloom. His family, my family, your family, the American family. When I teach his fiction or the story of his life, that's the full, imperfect humanity that I invite my students to engage, to examine, and to reflect upon. I invite them to share not a love story, but a true story. There you go. Thank you very much for having me here this evening.